The wind moved like a whisper through the streets of Lonesome Bend, dragging coils of dust across the boards of the old church and rattling the warped shutters of the saloon like the bones of a long-dead ghost. The town looked the same, and yet it didn't. Same sagging rooftops, same cracked well at the center of the square, same crooked sign above the sheriff's door. Only now there was no sheriff behind it. Just silence. The kind that settles and when law has packed its bags and left, and the wrong kind of men have filled the space it left behind. From the ridge above town, a lone figure stood still, watching. Clara hardly didn't blink as she stared down at the place that had buried her past and stolen her future. Her dress was plain, stiff from travel dust, and the high collar clung tight around her throat like a noose of memory. A wide-brimmed hat shaded her face, but even from a distance, something in the set of her jaw spoke of bones that had been hardened by sorrow, not age. She took the long way down, not because it was easier on the boots, but because it passed the tree. The old mesquite stood alone just off the path, gnarled and wind-gnawed, with one branch that bent like a crooked finger pointing west. Beneath it, a wooden marker tilted in the baked earth. The carving was rough, letters carved by someone who'd done their grieving with a blade. Asterisk Eli Hartley, 1861 to 1877. A good boy, asterisk. She knelt. No tears came, not anymore. The soil had long since dried them all. Her fingers brushed over the dirt, then pressed into it, firm and steady. The same hands that had once cradled a fevered brow now trembled slightly as they hovered over that crude piece of pine. She stayed like that for minutes, maybe longer, until the wind stirred again, tugging at her coat like a child's hand. Clara stood. Slung over her shoulder was a long, weathered case. The leather had faded to a tired gray, the brass buckles scuffed. It looked like it might hold a violin, or perhaps a length of fence post. It had been shut for 3 years. Now, it creaked softly with each step she took. The first townsfolk to notice her were the children, peeking from behind a horse trough, then scampering away when her eyes met theirs. Next came the whispers, from behind curtains, under the creak of porch swings. Old men at the barber's stoop paused their whittling. Clara Hartley, back from the grave. Thought she'd gone east, or maybe off the edge. She's just a woman. A woman with nothing left to lose. And then, with a tremor, like something darker riding the wind, she'd best not stir Reeves' boys. They don't take kindly to ghosts. The saloon hadn't changed. Same green paint peeling like sunburnt skin. Same piano missing 3 keys. Same wall of broken mirrors behind the bar. But the air inside was heavier now, like the dust didn't dare move too fast. Laughter drifted from the back, slow and mean. For men, boots on tables, hats tilted low, their belts heavy with more than liquor. Clara stepped inside. The light shifted, and every eye turned. Boots scraped on the floorboards. One of the gang, a lanky blonde with sunburned cheeks and a scar down his chin, froze mid-draw of a hand of cards. Another spit tobacco into a tin cup, never blinking. Behind the bar, Jed Langley reached under the counter, then paused, recognizing her. Clara moved like wind through wheat, graceful, unhurried. Her boots tapped across the boards as she crossed the room, each step brushing silence across the floor. She stopped just shy of the bar, setting the case down against a stool, her hands folded gently in front of her. Her eyes didn't scan, didn't waver. They found who they were looking for. Tucker Reeve wasn't there, but his younger brother, Colt, was. Just as mean, but without the sense. He smirked when he saw her. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, pushing up from his seat. "Look what the buzzards dragged back. You lost, Miss Hartley? Eastbound trains run the other way." Clara didn't answer. She reached into her coat and pulled out a single silver dollar, placing it on the counter with a soft clink. Colt narrowed his eyes. "You think this is some storybook comeback? You waltz in here. We all get scared, 'cause you once knew which end of a gun to hold." The man beside him chuckled, low and wet. "She's carrying a fiddle now. Maybe she's gonna play us a song. A funeral tune, huh, Miss Hartley?" Colt stepped closer. The saloon held its breath. His hand reached out, fingers hovering near her collar, like a boy trying to prove he could poke the sleeping bear. "You got a lot of nerve, coming back here. Maybe you forgot whose town this is now. Or maybe you need a little reminder. His fingers brushed the fabric at her neck. Her voice didn't rise, didn't waver. It cut through the room like a sharp wind off the canyon. You best not touch what you don't understand. The words weren't loud, but something in them made every man in that room suddenly remember the sound of a rifle chamber sliding home. Colt's hand froze mid-motion. He stared at her like she'd grown antlers. Behind the bar, Jed had stopped breathing. Clara didn't blink. Her hand stayed folded, but her eyes, those storm-gray eyes, held something older than fear and colder than revenge. Colt swallowed hard, stepped back. He tried to laugh. You ain't scaring anyone with a fiddle, lady. She tilted her head, just slightly, toward the case at her feet. The room stared. The wind howled once outside, catching the door and slamming it shut behind her with a thunderclap. And silence fell over Lonesome Bend. The canyon still echoed with ghosts. Clara stepped lightly along the trail, boots brushing against brittle scrub and the scorched remains of wildflowers long dead. The path twisted like a scar through the earth, hidden from the road and the eyes of men. Only a few ever knew of Reeves Gulch, and fewer still had ever dared come here alone. But it had once been her sanctuary, a place not marked on maps, but carved into her bones. The sky was heavy with a yellow haze, as if the sun itself had grown tired of looking down on this land. She reached the narrow mouth of the gulch and paused beneath an overhang of rock that curled like a lip whispering secrets. Then, from her shoulder, she slid the rifle case. The leather creaked with age and memory. She crouched on the same flat stone where she used to kneel as a younger woman, long before her hands knew the weight of a coffin nail or the shape of a child-sized casket. Dust rose gently around her. The silence here was a deeper thing, untouched by voices or sin. It had once soothed her. Now it pressed against her chest. The buckles came loose one by one, each snap echoing in her ears like a trigger pull. She opened the case. The rifle inside was long, elegant, darkened with oil, metal polished but worn at the grip. The initials H were burned into the stock. A faint line of notches ran beneath it, memories of shots that had counted, shots that had ended something. She wrapped her fingers around the barrel and lifted it gently, like touching a relic in church. But her hands betrayed her. They shook, subtle at first, then more. The muzzle wavered as she brought it up. The weight wasn't unfamiliar, just heavier than before. Or maybe she was simply no longer the woman who once carried it like a third limb. A breath caught in her throat. She tried to steady her stance. Her shoulder angled. Her foot pivoted, just as she had drilled it 100 times in those years that now felt like shadows. But when she raised the rifle, her eyes blurred, not from sun, but from the sting that lived behind them. She saw him. Eli, just 16, standing tall before Tucker Reeve and his drunken crew in the middle of the street. A broomstick in hand like it was a rifle, his voice loud, defiant. I ain't afraid of you. And then the shot. One. From behind. Not even a warning. The boy fell, the street took him, and the town watched in silence. Not one hand lifted. Clara had returned from the neighboring farm just minutes later. She'd found him there, still warm. No trial. No witness stood up. The sheriff packed his things and vanished within days. Lonesome Bend had made its choice. Silence was safer than justice. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She had gone home, closed the door, buried her son with her own hands. And then she left, not to mourn, but to remember who she had once been. The wind rose through the gulch now, tugging her coat like the tug of a child's grip. She lowered the rifle slowly, her breathing shallow. Her heart thundered, not with rage, but with something quieter, older. A sudden movement caught her eye. A jackrabbit sat 10 yards out, still as stone, its long ears twitching. It looked at her, not startled, not running, just watching. She raised the rifle again, muscle memory fighting the tremble, lined the sights with its chest. But she couldn't. Her finger rested near the trigger, unmoving. A breath passed. Then she lowered the rifle. The jackrabbit turned and bounded away through the brush, disappearing over a low ridge. She exhaled. Justice, not vengeance. The words settled in her chest like coals. Warm, smoldering, dangerous if mishandled. She was not here to punish the town. She was here to remind it what it had chosen to forget. As she packed the rifle back into the case, she heard a twig snap. Her eyes flicked up. No one was there, but she knew. The canyon had a way of catching sound and throwing it oddly. She was being watched. Maybe from the ridge, maybe from the trees beyond. She said nothing, didn't look around, just stood, fastened the buckles, and began the long walk back toward town. By dusk, the whispers had begun. Jed Langley leaned against the bar, polishing the same glass for the third time, staring out the saloon's front window. She was up in the gulch, he murmured. Billy Darnell looked up from his stool, eyes narrowed. Doing what? Jed didn't answer right away. He turned the glass slowly, thinking about the way Clara's voice had cut through the room earlier that day. Clean, cold, final. He set the glass down. Ghost Heart is back. Billy scoffed. That's just a story. Old war tale. Jed leaned in. You think a schoolteacher can cut 3 playing cards in half at 60 paces? Billy fell quiet. Outside, the town moved a little more cautiously. Curtains fluttered, closed a little faster. Doors were bolted even in daylight. The Reeve boys joked louder at the saloon, but their eyes watched the shadows near the door. Colt Reeve didn't sleep well that night. He kept reaching for the revolver on his nightstand every time a board creaked. The wind seemed louder than usual, full of whispers and boots. And Clara? She sat alone on the porch of her old homestead, oiling the rifle slowly. The boards groaned beneath her rocking chair. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't hunting. She was waiting. The land would tell her when the time was right. And when it did, they'd all remember why the name Ghost Heart was once whispered in tents and foxholes, feared by generals, and prayed against by men who had thought themselves untouchable. They'd remember, because justice had come back to Lonesome Bend, and it had steady hands, gray eyes, and a rifle that had waited too long to speak. The porch sagged beneath her weight as Clara stepped out into the last light of day. The sun had just begun to kiss the edge of the horizon, casting the Hartley homestead in gold and rust, shadows long and trembling across the overgrown yard. The weeds had grown tall in the years she'd been gone, crabgrass swallowing the old chicken coop, ivy climbing the porch beams like time trying to erase what was once built with love. She set the lantern on the top step. Its glass was smudged, but the flame inside danced steady, stubborn. Like her. In her hands, she held the rifle case, like a prayer not yet spoken. Dust rose in the distance. 5 horses. She didn't move. Just sat back down in the rocking chair her husband had built, boots firm on the wood, the rifle case resting across her lap. The wind shifted again, bringing the scent of sweat and saddle and something fouler, the stink of men who believed they owned fear. Tucker Reeve rode in first. He didn't dismount right away. Just sat tall in the saddle, arms loose, revolver gleaming at his hip. His gang followed behind, Colt among them, jaw still stiff from the silence she'd carved into him back at the saloon. They formed a crooked half-circle around the porch, as if the angle of their numbers could press her back into the shadows. A few townsfolk lingered at the edge of the road, peeking from behind fence posts and windows, drawn by the dust and the gathering tension. "Well now," Tucker said, spitting a black streak into the grass. "Ain't this a picture? Widow Hartley, sitting pretty like a ghost come home." He dismounted slowly, theatrically. The creak of leather and boots on gravel punctuated his swagger. He stepped up close, stopping just shy of the porch. "Town says you've been shooting again," he said. "You trying to start something, Clara?" She didn't answer. He squinted, smiled a slow, mean smile. "Tell me, was it here he died?" He scanned the porch, the door, the windows. "Did the boy cry out for you? Or just fall over dumb, like a sack of potatoes?" The laughter from the gang was thick and sour. One of them slapped his thigh. Colt looked away. Tucker stepped up one more stair, spit right on the wooden planks near her boot. The saliva sizzled on the warm wood. Clara rose. She didn't say a word, just bent slowly, opened the latch on the case, and drew the rifle into the dusk. The sound of the case creaking open silenced even the wind. She lit the lantern. Then she looked at them, each of them, and her voice, when it came, was low but clear, carved in stone. "Turn and ride," she said, "or stay and see what I buried with my boy." A long beat passed. Then Colt barked a nervous laugh. Another man snorted. Tucker just shook his head. "Lady, you've gone soft. That gun ain't nothing but a story now. Like your boy." One of the gang, a short man with a mustache like rat whiskers, stepped forward, hand outstretched. "You don't scare us," he said. "You're just—" His fingers reached for her collar. The shot rang out so fast it barely had a beginning. A shockwave snapped through the air. His hat flew off his head, spinning like a broken wheel, and a neat streak of blood bloomed across his temple. Not deep, but real. Enough to make him fall back with a cry, clutching his face. The horses shrieked and shifted. The men froze. Clara didn't move. Smoke curled from the barrel like the end of a sentence. In the silence that followed, a curtain fluttered across the street. A woman behind it whispered to no one, or maybe to the child clinging to her skirt. "That's not a woman," she said. "That's the ghost." Tucker's smirk faded. He took a half-step back. Clara's eyes didn't leave him. The town had forgotten her name. They'd let her fade, like so much dust on the windowsill. But in that moment, something ancient and undeniable returned. It shimmered in the air between them, not fury, not vengeance. Truth. She wasn't here to show strength. She was here to remind them what justice looked like when it had nothing left to lose. Then, from behind a fence, a small figure emerged. Barefoot, dress torn at the hem, a child maybe 7, maybe younger. She walked slowly, watching Clara the way the jackrabbit had days before. No one moved to stop her. She climbed the porch steps with cautious awe and stood beside Clara, small fingers wrapping around the hem of her coat. Her voice was no louder than a bird's breath. "Will you protect us?" Clara looked down. For the first time that day, her eyes softened. She nodded. Just once. The child smiled barely, then leaned against her leg, like she'd known her all her life. Tucker shifted uncomfortably in the silence, the bravado draining from him like oil from a cracked lantern. Colt looked pale. No one else stepped forward. Clara lowered the rifle, just enough to let the message settle in. "Turn and ride." The flame and the lantern danced between them all. And the town, for the first time in years, remembered how it felt to be still. The sky had not yet turned gold when the boots began to line the square. Dust curled around spurs and horse hooves as Tucker's men fanned out across the open plaza, rifles slung, mouth smirking. The old church bell hung crooked in its tower, unmoved by the rising sun. Wood-paneled storefronts, each bearing the weight of decades and bullets, sat still under the hush of morning tension. From behind shuttered windows, eyes watched but dared not blink. The town of Lonesome Bend had held its breath for years. Now it held it tighter. Tucker stood in the middle of it all, arms open like he was addressing a crowd that would one day carve his name into stone. His black duster flapped in the rising breeze, and his grin stretched too wide. "Bring her out," he called, voice thick with amusement, hands cocked on his hips. "Let the ghost walk." Clara Hart walked out of the sheriff's office alone. No badge, no rifle drawn. Just her and that heavy silence she carried like a second skin. The wind lifted her coat behind her as she moved through the center of the street. Every step landed like a drumbeat on the heart of the town. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. Her eyes, cool as river stone, stayed locked on Tucker's. From behind lace curtains and dusty blinds, the townsfolk watched. Children clung to their mothers. Men with rifles kept them lowered. No one wanted to die for a whisper of hope. Tucker's boots scraped as he approached her, casual and mocking. "Thought maybe you'd come crawling, Clara," he drawled, voice oiled with cruelty. "On your knees, with that pretty rifle held out like an apology." She stopped just short of him. He leaned in, hand reaching toward her collar like he had before. "Say you're sorry, sweetheart." Her knees bent, but not in surrender. She dropped, spun, and with the smooth pull of practiced breath, her rifle cracked like a lightning snap across the plains. 1, 2, 3. 3 men fell. One clutched his leg, screaming. Another dropped his weapon, gasping, blood oozing from a graze across his shoulder. The third collapsed with a broken wrist, his gun flung 10 feet from his body. Not one fatal shot, but none of them would rise today. Tucker staggered back, face white. Clara stood slowly, eyes never leaving his. "I don't miss," she said. The street echoed with the sound of a town waking to its heartbeat. Tucker's face twisted. His hand went to his holster. Clara didn't move fast. She moved with certainty. Her rifle coughed thunder one last time. The bullet cracked through Tucker's shoulder, shattering his collarbone like dry wood. He dropped to the dirt, his scream scraping against the walls of every building. Then there was silence. The dust, once kicked into the air by Tucker's bravado, now settled softly around Clara's boots. Somewhere a door creaked open. The first, then another. From across the square, the little girl appeared again, her feet bare, her hair pulled back with a scrap of ribbon. She stepped beside Clara and looked at the man writhing on the ground. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Clara's breath was slow. She turned, scanning the doorways, the windows where faces now peered out, no longer hiding, but still afraid. Mothers, carpenters, old men in rocking chairs. The town wasn't gone. It had just forgotten how to live. She looked to the sky, where the rising sun had turned the dust red gold. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Only if they never forget." Tucker whimpered behind her, cradling his useless arm. His gang lay groaning, disarmed. No one moved to help him, not even the bartender, who finally stepped onto the porch with his apron still on and a rifle resting against the doorway. Not even the banker, not even the preacher. Clara turned and began to walk. The girl followed, small hand brushing against Clara's coat. Behind them, the sun finished rising over the rooftops. The blood in the dust turned gold, and the town began to breathe again. The ground was still soft from spring rain when Clara pressed the rifle down into it, with meeting dirt with a quiet finality. Her fingers lingered on the stock for a moment longer, tracing the worn initials one last time. She had buried the locket here years ago, with her son's name etched above it on a slab of pine. Now the rifle joined them. Steel and wood and grief, laid to rest together under the crooked mesquite tree. No words were spoken. The orphan girl, Sarah, as she'd quietly whispered when asked, stood nearby, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers in her scratched hands. She watched Clara the way a foal watches the mare, eyes wide with cautious trust. Clara rose slowly. The ache in her knees reminded her of the years, of the long walk through sorrow and silence. She looked down at the grave, then up at the horizon where the sun bled pale through scattered clouds. She adjusted her coat, brushed a line of dust from her skirt, and took the girl's hand. When they walked back to town, no one blocked their path. The crowd had scattered after the standoff. Reeves' men had gone. Some rode out under cover of night. Tucker had left with a busted collarbone and something broken in his eyes, something that would never quite heal. The saloon door creaked as Clara passed it the next morning. No jeers, no laughter, just a few cautious nods. Jed Langley poured her a cup of coffee and set it down without asking for a coin. "We figured you'd be riding out," he said. Clara sipped slowly, then looked out the dusty window where Sarah sat on the porch, swinging her legs. "Justice is staying," she said. "Vengeance would be leaving." The town didn't know what to do with that, but they began slowly to change. They fixed the church roof, boarded up the old jail again, and let the children walk home from school without watching the road for horsemen. The whispers faded, the guns quieted, and Clara stayed. Not as a sheriff or a preacher. She had no badge, no sermons. She swept the porch, taught Sarah how to read, and showed her how to keep a lantern burning through the wind. She spoke rarely, but people came to her, quietly, respectfully. A boy with bruised hands who wanted to stop working for the man who stole cattle. A widow who'd hidden her husband's rifle and didn't know if it was time to dig it up. A farmer who couldn't sleep without hearing the echo of a shot. Clara never offered judgment, only truth. And over time, the legend grew. They began calling the hill by the Tree Heart's Rise. Children dared each other to walk near it at dusk, hoping to hear her voice carried on the wind. And then, one spring, a new sheriff rode into Lonesome Bend. He was young, clean-shaven, eager to set right what he imagined had fallen apart. On his second day, he sat at the bar and asked Jed, "So who was it that cleaned this place up before I got here?" Jed didn't answer right away, just wiped down a glass, looked out toward the edge of town where the canyon opened wide and the dust carried old names. "She didn't clean it," he said finally, voice low and even. "She reminded it who it belonged to." The sheriff squinted. "Who?" Jed only nodded toward the ridge. That evening, the sheriff walked out to the edge of town, boots kicking up loose sand, hat pulled low against the setting sun. He climbed the ridge and found the tree. Not much to look at, gnarled and half dead, clutching at the sky like a beggar. At its base was a stone, smooth and plain, but carved with care. No date, no epitaph. Just words, bold and quiet. Clara Hart, the ghost who spoke without raising her voice. The wind came then, soft but certain. It pulled at the sheriff's coat, whistled through the rocks, and carried something like reverence in its sound. Far off, back in town, the girl Clara had once sheltered, no longer so small, lit the porch lantern and waited for night to fall.